It's my real pleasure and honor to introduce Ben Santer. Ben is our inaugural Wilkes Visiting Chair, which is a very prestigious position, and we have the luxury and real pleasure of hosting him for 3 weeks here on campus. So it's a real honor in many ways. Ben also has affiliations with Woods Hole. He's the Fowler Distinguished Scholar in Residence there, as well as a visiting researcher at UCLA. Ben got his doctorate from the University of East Anglia with Professor Tom Wigley. Afterwards, he did a postdoc at Max Planck in Hamburg, working with Professor Klaus Hasselmann, who many of you probably recognize, sharing the Nobel Prize with Suki Manabe and others just a few years ago. After that, Ben spent many decades at Lawrence Livermore in the Program for Climate Model Diagnosis and Intercomparison. And probably many of us know him from his fingerprinting work that he pioneered for many decades. So in terms of awards, there's a lot. So I just focus on the highlights. So Ben has won the MacArthur Fellowship. He's a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And also happy to say, Ben is the recipient of the 2023 Rossby Award from the AMS. So please join me in welcoming Ben.
Thank you so much, John, for that kind introduction. And I retired from Lawrence Livermore National Lab after 30 years in September of 2021. I think it's fair to say that I'm failing retirement pretty miserably. And one of the joys of my life is that even as an old dude, I'm still continuing to do things that I really wanted to do but never got around to. And I'm going to talk to you about one of those legacy projects today, extending fingerprinting into the mid to upper stratosphere, so up to 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. We never quite got there. We lacked the models that had sufficiently high tops and sufficient resolution in the mid to upper stratosphere. We lacked reliable satellite-based measurements of atmospheric temperature changes. And now there's this consilience, if you will, this availability of suitable model simulations, satellite observations that really enables us to look at a critical region of Earth's atmosphere where 55 years ago, Suki Manabe and Dick Weatherall predicted that we should see a very clear radiative signal of human-caused CO2 increases. So today's talk is mostly about, was Suki Manabe right back in 1967? I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of fingerprinting as it relates to atmospheric temperature changes. And then I'm going to talk to you about this new work, extending fingerprinting from what we and others have done previously, which is basically looking from the Earth's surface up to about 25 kilometers, so into the lower stratosphere, with weather balloon measurements and satellite measurements, and now this new work extending fingerprinting to 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And I'm going to break that down into two parts. First, I'm going to tell you something about the size of global mean temperature changes in different layers of the atmosphere. And then we're going to get into the meat of the talk, the pattern analysis. And finally, some conclusions. So we're going to focus only on the troposphere and on the stratosphere, and only up to about 50 kilometers in today's talk. And we're going to look at satellite measurements of atmospheric temperature. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these beautiful measurements. They look at the microwave emissions of oxygen molecules that are proportional to the temperature of different broad layers of the atmosphere. And these microwave emissions are monitored by a variety of sensors on a variety of polar orbiting satellites. And by measuring at different microwave frequencies, you can back out the temperature of different broad layers of the atmosphere. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. And I would argue transformationally beautiful, because it really gives us a global scale understanding of the vertical structure of atmospheric temperature change that we sort of had with weather balloons, but weather balloons had many of their own problems, didn't have true global coverage. Satellites have a lot of advantages in terms of monitoring global changes in the thermal structure of Earth's atmosphere. These are so-called weighting functions. So these give you some information about the microwave emissions that are being sampled by different instruments on different satellites at different frequencies. And most of the focus has been traditionally on 20 to 25 kilometers above the Earth's surface on these microwave sounders. This, for example, this yellow trace here are the emissions in the lower stratosphere, peaking at about 18 kilometers above the surface. We'll talk a little bit about this particular temperature measurement. We'll talk also about the mid to upper troposphere, which you see here in red. And we'll talk about the lower troposphere, which you see here in orange. The kicker is that these stratospheric sounding units and advanced microwave sounders provide us with information from about 25 to 70 kilometers above the surface. And these are very broad weighting functions. In some cases, they overlap, as you can see. And what we can do in climate model world is try and emulate them. We can essentially fly satellites through model simulation output and try and mimic how these microwave sounders actually see Earth's atmosphere in order to generate a fair apples to apples comparison between the actual satellite data and the simulation output. It's a bit computationally expensive, but this is sort of what many people do today. Also, in terms of clouds, we have emulators in order to facilitate comparisons between actual satellite measurements and model simulation output. So this is the space we're going to operate in. And as mentioned, again, we're going to look at 6 broad atmospheric layers: the lower troposphere, the mid to upper troposphere, the lower stratosphere, and then these 3 stratospheric sounding unit, or SSU channels, which peak from 30 to 45 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And as I mentioned, previous work in this area really only looked at these 3 lower channels. So previous fingerprint studies looked at the troposphere and looked at the lower stratosphere up to about 25 kilometers, but they didn't look above that. And what we're going to do today is see whether we get more discriminatory power, so greater ability to distinguish between human and natural effects on climate, if in addition to the 3 lower layers, we go into the mid to upper stratosphere and include these 3 stratospheric sounding unit layers. So, some relevant history. Let's set the stage here. Many of you are familiar with this distinguished gentleman, Professor Suki Manabe at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab. As John mentioned, Suki Manabe won 1/3 of the share of the 2021 Nobel Physics Prize for, quote, physical modeling of Earth's climate, quantifying variability, and reliably predicting global warming. So one of the papers that the Nobel Committee called out specifically and highlighted in the award to Suki Manabe was a very influential paper published in the Journal of Atmospheric Sciences in 1967 with his GFDL colleague Dick Weatherald. And in various assessments of the most important papers in climate science, this is frequently deemed to be number 1, the most important and influential paper. What you see here are results from a so-called radiative convective model. So a simple climate model that resolves different layers of Earth's atmosphere, and it has convection in there, it has radiative transfer, It only gives you global mean changes in temperature, though. And what Manabe and Weatherall did in this simple radiative convective model is they increased levels of atmospheric CO2 from 150 to 300 to 600 parts per million. And when they did that, they saw that the stratosphere cooled and the troposphere warmed. Another thing to focus on here is that the size of the stratospheric cooling amplifies the higher up you get into the atmosphere. This is altitude in kilometers, so we're going to about 45 kilometers of the Earth's surface. A key point here is this is a true prediction. So this is 1967. We don't really have satellite measurements of atmospheric temperature change, at least not at global scale. We have some weather balloon measurements of atmospheric temperature change from the late 40s and 50s onwards, but many of the early weather balloons didn't have the structural integrity to get into the mid to upper stratosphere. They actually burst. So we didn't have reliable observational estimates of how stratospheric temperature changed over time in 1967 when Manabe and Weatherall performed these simple experiments. They could have been wrong. And one of the questions is, were they wrong? What do satellite measurements actually show about observed temperature changes in this region of the atmosphere? So why does the stratosphere cool? I'm sure many of you have seen or in your courses looked at figures like this, would show in red the downwelling solar radiation as a function of wavelength, and in blue the outgoing long wave radiation, primarily in the infrared, as the Earth heats up and tries to emit heat to space. And you also see here on the bottom the absorption spectra for various atmospheric trace constituents, water vapor, carbon dioxide. And the kicker is that there's the absorption window of CO2, and that absorption window is very close to the atmospheric region, spectral region through which the Earth is trying to shed heat to space. So human-caused enhancement of the natural greenhouse effect is partially closing this window by which the Earth is trying to emit heat to space. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Not a surprise, really. Concentrations of CO2 are increasing throughout the atmosphere, and CO2 both absorbs and emits infrared radiation. And whether a given atmospheric layer warms or cools depends on the net balance in absorption versus emission. As we increase CO2 in the troposphere, it makes it more difficult for IR radiation to reach the stratosphere. And as Gavin Schmidt nicely put it in a post on Real Climate, extra stratospheric CO2 molecules then see less radiation to absorb coming up because of this increase in CO2, but they are totally happy emitting more, half of which goes up into space. So the net effect is less absorption and more emittance in the stratosphere, and thus they give a cooling. The effect is larger the further up you go. Again, it's not quite as simple as this because there's also the role of water vapor. The stratosphere is dry, there isn't much water vapor, so there's less water vapor in the stratosphere to absorb increased emission from the troposphere. There's a very nice paper published back in 2016 that I can point you to that tries to disentangle these various effects, but basically the physics is pretty well understood here. And again, what we're going to look at is whether this prediction, Manabe and Weatherall prediction, of cooling of the stratosphere with cooling amplifying the higher up you go is in accord with current state-of-the-art model simulations. Well, the next part of the history is this guy. As John mentioned, Professor Klaus Hasselmann was the director of the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg at the time I did my postdoc. And he was also one of the recipients of the 2021 Nobel Physics Prize. for his work in fingerprinting. And this, again, is a quote from the Nobel Committee. Hasselmann developed methods for identifying specific signals, fingerprints, that both natural phenomena and human activities imprint in the climate. And the premise was that by looking beyond global mean changes at patterns of change, you could more effectively discriminate between human and natural causes. So this just gives you a brief example. We're not going to go into the details of each picture. These are model simulations performed at NCAR a while ago now with the old parallel climate model developed by Warren Washington et al. And what you see are slices through the atmosphere from the North Pole to the South Pole and from the surface up to 30 kilometers. And in a series of innovative experiments back in the early 90s, Warren and colleagues changed only one thing at a time: the sun's energy output, according to our best understanding of natural changes in solar irradiance over the 20th century. Or they changed stratospheric loadings of volcanic aerosols, again, according to our best understanding of the actual estimated changes in volcanic aerosols. Or they change greenhouse gases, according to how CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, CFCs had actually changed. Or they change sulfate aerosols, particulate sulfate pollution, or they change tropospheric and stratospheric ozone. And again, each one of these things is a model calculation that shows the fingerprint, if you will, the pattern of climate response to this one unique thing. So Einstein would have loved this stuff. He was very fond of Gedankenexperimente, thought experiments that you could do in your mind, but not in the real world. In climate models, you can do these kind of Gedankenexperimente where you change just one thing. And of course, in the real world, all of these things are changing simultaneously. And the premise in Hasselmann's work was that if we understand these response patterns, we can disentangle human and natural effects on climate. So again, using Manabe's prediction and using Hasselmann's fingerprint methods, we published a paper in Nature back in 1996, where we tried to do fingerprinting with the vertical structure of atmospheric temperature, but again, only looking at the lowest 25 kilometers of the Earth's atmosphere. And we concluded we have identified a component of the observational record that shows a statistically significant similarity with model predictions. This wasn't eureka, there's water in the bathtub, we understand everything. But even this relatively cautious conclusion was not well loved by critics at the time, who accused us of all sorts of data manipulation and misdeeds. And the way science works, of course, is that you kick the tires, you see whether criticism is valid, you repeat, as we did, the kind of analysis that we did with observational weather balloon data with satellite data. And others kick the tires too. They try and replicate what you've done. We'll talk a little bit about that independent replication later. But basically what we showed was that a model calculation of the vertical structure of atmospheric temperature change, from close to the surface up to 20 kilometers, showed similarities and differences with weather balloon-based estimates. Both showed this broad pattern of warming of the troposphere sustained over most latitudes, and cooling of the lower stratosphere with largest cooling over the Antarctic ozone hole. But there were some noticeable differences too, particularly in terms of this cooling behavior here in the observations that was absent in these early model simulations of ozone effects on climate. As I mentioned, we then thought about looking in the mid to upper stratosphere and focusing on this 25 to 50 kilometer region that Manabe and Weatherald had looked at. But it was difficult to do that in the 2000s, the early 2000s in particular, because the observations didn't agree. So David Thompson and colleagues published a very influential paper in Nature in 2012 called The Mystery of Recent Stratospheric Temperature Trends. And they recognized that stratospheric temperature trends play an important role in being able to distinguish between human and natural effects on climate, because the direct radiative signature of CO2 is so clear the higher up you get in the stratosphere. And what Thompson et al. Showed was these are global mean temperature changes for these three stratospheric sounding unit channels, channel 3, channel 2, channel 1. This is the lower stratosphere, the microwave sounding unit. You can see the sort of regions, my apologies, my thumb is too big. Sampled by the atmospheric regions, sampled by these different channels. And the kicker is that the gray are model simulations, mostly from phase 5 of the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, or CMIP. And the red and the blue are from two different observational groups. Cheng-Shi Shu's group at NOAA in Maryland, and the Hadley Center group here in blue. And you can see that there's substantial disagreements between the two satellite groups. And those agreements are not unique to stratospheric sounding unit data. They've also been a staple lower down in the atmosphere, accounting for satellite orbit drift, instrument calibration drift, changes in instruments from microwave sounders to advanced microwave sounders, dealing with the effects of orbit drift on the sampling of the diurnal cycle. These are complex technical issues, and different groups make different decisions in order to account for these non-climatic influences. So it took a while, arguably until about 5 years ago, for the NOAA and Met Office groups to really come to some better agreement in terms of stratospheric temperature changes. And we have, like I said, we have better model simulations too now, with higher model tops, with more vertical resolution in the mid to upper stratosphere, and arguably with better representation of some of the key forcings, ozone, CFCs, etc., that have changed. So in 2013, we actually looked at satellite temperature measurements for the first time to do vertical fingerprinting, and concluded that, as we had found with the weather balloon data, the observed changes were consistent with model human influence calculations, but fundamentally inconsistent with estimates of natural climate variability. Even if we looked at model last millennium simulations that included volcanic eruptions and solar irradiance changes much larger than those we've seen over the instrumental period. Okay, so what happens when we extend fingerprinting to 50 kilometers above the surface? This just shows you the time series in simulations and observations of global mean temperature changes. And on the left, I'm first of all giving you the microwave sounder results. So this shows you the cooling of the lower stratosphere here. This big blip here is the effect of the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. Pinatubo emitted a lot of sulfur dioxide. Some of that affected the lower stratosphere, absorbed incoming solar radiation and outgoing long wave radiation, heated the lower stratosphere. And you can see that heating signal here in the models and in the observations, and cooled the troposphere, which again, you can see in the simulations and the observations. The model results are from 9 different CMIP-6 models, so latest, greatest simulations that fed into the IPCC's 6th assessment report. The black line is the average of these 9 models, and the gray lines are individual realizations. I think there's something like 30 realizations here. And again, we've used this emulator to try and emulate the satellite temperature measurements in model simulation world. So you can see that in both simulations and observations, the troposphere has warmed and the lower stratosphere has cooled. But you can also see here that natural internal variability, look at these month to month and year to year gray excursions here, is pretty big. So the noise is big in the troposphere. It's smaller in the lower stratosphere. But when you start looking at the SSU channels, so these stratospheric sounding unit measurements and the model simulations, you can see something really interesting, that the gray here and the blue observational month to month and year to year fluctuations through internal variability are trivially small relative to the overall signal. So relative to this very large global mean cooling signal in the stratosphere, look how this amplifies from roughly 1.7 degrees Celsius to over 2 degrees Celsius cooling, and it dwarfs the magnitude of internal fluctuations of climate. You can also see that even in the mid to upper stratosphere, you still get this warming signal from the Pinatubo eruption. And you can also see nicely too this roughly 11-year solar irradiance cycle in there. But even without any complex fingerprinting, one of the take-home messages from this is this cooling signal is huge relative to natural fluctuations, associated with the sun, and relative to intrinsic variability month to month, year to year, and decade to decade. So let's now, yes.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I'm curious what the cause is of the step-like change in stratospheric temperatures across the Pinatubo eruption.
After Pinatubo?
Yeah, like before Pinatubo, those anomalies are quite large and positive. Pinatubo happens, and then after that, it's much lower.
Yeah, so
it's more than just the eruption. It almost like it caused a step change in stratospheric temperatures.
yeah, and a number of people have written about that step function change, and one of the reasons for it appears to be associated with ozone. So after Pinatubo, there was a jump in the depletion of stratospheric ozone. And Susan Solomon and her colleagues at MIT have looked at that. And it seems like these volcanic stratospheric aerosols formed the surfaces on which this complex heterogeneous chemistry took place that depleted ozone. And you see this in the ozone records, not only after Pinatubo, but also after the earlier eruption of El Chichon in 1982. So when you deplete ozone in the stratosphere, ozone being a greenhouse gas, you cool, the net effect is cooling, and that's part of this as well. This volcanically induced change in concentrations of lower stratospheric ozone. I defer though to Jessica, who's the real atmospheric chemist in the room.
Yeah, I actually did the stratospheric volcano heterogeneous chemistry from my undergrad season. So I'll be more about it.
Yeah. So that's part of it. And indeed, there's a very nice paper in Science by Ramaswamy et al. The Science Ramaswamy, who did these single forcing experiments with ozone changes only and CO2 changes only, and looked at the stratospheric temperature signals associated with these individual forcings. And you see then in those kind of simulations, the profound impact of volcanically induced ozone changes in the lower stratosphere. Anyway, let's now look at this, not in time series space, but in trend space. And we're looking at the same period we just looked at in the previous figure, 1986 through to 2022, so very close to present. 1986, because that's the beginning of continuous information from these stratospheric sounding units. And I've set this up in these 6 layers that we're looking at, from the stratosphere SSU channel 3 right down to the lower troposphere. And the gray dots are from these roughly 30 plus individual realizations of temperature change over this period in CMIP6 historical runs. And the black square is the multi-model average from these 9 models. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in results from control integrations. So these are runs without any changes in external forcings from year to year, without changes in CO2, volcanoes, that just give you estimates of the pure internal variability of, in this case, atmospheric temperature. And because we have many thousands of years of control run data, we can build up a distribution of 37-year trends. Again, 37 years is 1986 through to 2022. And this, these are the distributions here that you can see. And the x-axis here is identical for each of these sub-panels. So you can see that noise is larger in the troposphere, and the higher up you get in the stratosphere, the more difficult it is through natural causes alone to get large positive or negative 37-year trends. You can also see that these distributions have the desirable property that they're quasi-Gaussian and they're centered on 0, right? In model control runs, you have the same chance roughly of getting a large positive trend as large negative trend. And the kicker is that if you look at the relationship between the model trends in the historical runs, so again, these guys up here in gray, drat that thumb, in gray and in black, and the control run trends, you can see that the higher up you get in the stratosphere, the further away the historical trends are from purely natural trends. The signal, the global mean signal, is very large relative to the intrinsic variability estimated from the models there. Now, finally, we're going to add the satellite measurements to this figure, and you can see that it's the same thing in the satellite data. There are different dots because there are different combinations of satellite temperature data from different groups. But the bottom line is that in the satellite data, as in the model simulations, the estimated stratospheric cooling gets higher, gets larger, the higher up you get into the atmosphere. And even in the troposphere, you can see that the dots, the colored dots, are outside the range of intrinsic variability estimated from the models. But, you know, a take-home message for this is, wow, go to 30 to 50 kilometers above the surface, and signal to noise is very favorable. Okay, so let's do a proper pattern analysis now. These are the patterns of atmospheric temperature change over 1986 through to 2022 in these 9 different climate models that participated in the latest phase of the coupled model intercomparison program. And this is the multi-model average, this MMA here. And what you can see here is as you go from the South Pole to the North Pole and from close to the surface up to 50 kilometers, you have in every model this coherent warming of the troposphere, with largest warming over the Arctic, where we have the largest retreat of Arctic sea ice, cooling of the stratosphere, with cooling amplifying the higher up you get into the stratosphere. These dots just show you, tell you something about the agreement between the 9 individual models that we're looking at. And areas like here where there are no dots mean this is a region where there's some disagreement in terms of the model-based estimates of the temperature changes. But the bottom line is these model patterns of the vertical structure of atmospheric temperature change are very similar to what we see in the satellite data. These are the satellite measurements. Whoa. I think I'm just gonna go back to analog technology. So these are the satellite measurements here. Again, combinations from two different groups. They too show this coherent warming of the troposphere, cooling of the stratosphere. Intriguingly, they show that over this 37-year period, 86 through to 2022, there's been some asymmetry in the cooling of the mid to upper stratosphere. And some models here, like MRI, Japanese model, actually capture some of that asymmetry. So the next thing we're going to do is we're essentially going to look for this model predicted pattern of atmospheric temperature change in the observations and in individual realizations of the model historical simulations. So how do we do that? Well, imagine we have satellite data from 1986 through to present, and I'm just going to step through 3 years at a time the individual vertical temperature changes for these years, starting in 1986 through to 1989. Here's 1992. Again, we're going from the surface up to 50 kilometers, and this is in this 6 space, these 6 layers that we're looking at. And you can see that over time here, what's happening is the troposphere is warming and the stratosphere is cooling. And we want to know, is this pattern of atmospheric temperature change in accord with the model predicted human fingerprint over 86 through to 2022? So we calculate some measure of pattern similarity. This is just an uncentered spatial covariance statistic between the search for human influence fingerprint and this sequence of individual patterns of satellite temperature change. And you can see that the pattern similarity time series shows a trend, which is in accord with what our eyes tell us here, that over time, the satellite measurements are becoming more similar spatially to the search for human influence fingerprint. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff that we know and love here, like this big dip here in 1991, that's Pinatubo. So Pinatubo is warming the stratosphere and cooling the troposphere, which is the converse of the search for human influence fingerprint. The bottom line is, you know, we have this trend in pattern similarity. Is this significant? So to address this question, you require a null distribution of pattern similarity. So you need to generate a distribution of how pattern similarity might change in the absence of any human effect on climate. And we use the control runs to do that. Again, these simulations without year-to-year changes in CO2 or other external forcings. And we have many thousands of years of these simulations. I'm going through the first 3,600 here, stepping through 300 years at a time. And you can see, let's do that again, that they're very noisy. You know, there are areas where temperature increases, where temperature decreases, but the patterns are quite noisy and small scale compared to what we just saw in the satellite data. You can do the same thing then, compare these patterns of intrinsic variability with the search for human influence fingerprint, calculate some pattern similarity time series. I'm only showing the first 400 years here, and then fit 37-year trends to that, just as we did for the actual 37-year satellite record. So we can then build up a distribution of natural trends in pattern similarity between the fingerprint and intrinsic variability. Before I show you what that distribution looks like, all I want to illustrate here is look at the big mismatch in terms of the size here. So this is the same y-axis in both of these subpanels. The left panel shows you the actual time increasing similarity between the model predicted human influence fingerprint and the satellite data. The right panel shows you the same thing, but for the human influence fingerprint compared with the intrinsic variability data from the control run. There's a huge mismatch in the size. And that gives us this result then. From the many, many thousands of years of control run data, we build up this distribution of pattern similarity trends due to natural variability. And this is what we actually got here, the trend in pattern similarity between the fingerprint and the satellite data. Again, without needing to do any fancy statistics, you can see that it's virtually impossible to obtain the observational result by natural variability, which comports with what we saw in the global mean temperature changes. The stratospheric cooling signal, particularly the higher up you get, is huge relative to intrinsic variability. But there's more to it. This isn't just global mean, as I'll try and convince you now. We also get the result I showed you in the last slide because of pattern differences. So here again is the model predicted human influence fingerprint showing tropospheric warming and stratospheric cooling. Here from the control runs are the model estimated patterns of internal variability. They're fundamentally different. They're much smaller in scale. And this is from all 9 control runs stacked end to end. You see, for example, anti-correlations between temperature changes in the tropics and the extratropics, or anti-correlations between temperature changes at high latitudes in both hemispheres. Natural internal variability can't give you this latitudinally coherent, sustained, temporally sustained warming of the troposphere and cooling of the stratosphere. So that's part of the reason we're getting this this big signal to noise ratio that I showed you in the last figure. It's not just the global mean. The human fingerprint is acting like a pattern filter. And you can see that more clearly in this scatter plot here. So this is taking the fingerprint pattern for these 4 different regions, atmospheric regions. So for the 3 layers, SSU 3, 2, and 1 of the mid to upper stratosphere, for all 6 layers that we looked at, so the 3 SSU layers and the 3 MSU layers. This is only for the 3 MSU layers, so the troposphere and the lower stratosphere, and this is for the troposphere only. And what we're doing is for each of those 4 vertical domains, we're calculating the human influence fingerprint, and we're comparing with the patterns of natural variability in the control runs. And the kicker is that if you look in the mid to upper stratosphere, or if you look at all 6 layers from the surface right up to the upper stratosphere, the fingerprint is virtually uncorrelated with the patterns of intrinsic variability. But in the troposphere, that's not the case. There's much more pattern similarity between forced temperature changes and intrinsic variability. So again, this critical region of the atmosphere from 25 to 50 kilometers above the surface has very desirable properties because the fingerprint doesn't look like the noise. It's virtually orthogonal to it. And that helps you because the satellite data project well onto the fingerprint, but intrinsic variability doesn't. That's the message from this figure here. So I'm almost ready to wrap it up here. One of the statements we made in our recently published PNAS paper about this work was that in going from this, what we had done before, so looking at the vertical structure of temperature changes up to 25 kilometers, to this, going from the surface right up to 50 kilometers, we got about a factor 5 increase in the signal to noise ratio. And you can see that here. Here we're actually looking for the model predicted fingerprints in each of these vertical layers. So the 3 SSU layers, the 6 layers here, the full vertical structure, the 3 lower layers only, and the 2 tropospheric layers only. And we're doing that analysis as a function of time scale right out to 37 years, the total length of the record. And the kicker here, the main thing to compare is the blue and the green. So the green is the signal to noise that we were getting previously. And the blue is what we're getting now by including the mid to upper stratosphere. It's a huge bump up in ability to separate a human fingerprint from natural variability. And we see the same thing. This is looking for the fingerprint in individual realizations of historical climate change. We see exactly the same thing when we look in the satellite data. Again, compare the green with the blue here. This huge bump up in signal to noise ratio when we're searching for the model fingerprint in actual satellite data. So the bottom line is Manabe and Weatherall were right in 1967. This is a critical portion of the atmosphere to look at. And they recognized this a long time ago. The initial work that was done in fingerprinting neglected this critical region of the atmosphere. We can now look at it. And as I just showed you, including information from 25 to 50 kilometers above the surface enhances your ability to identify a human fingerprint on climate by a factor of 5. Why is that? It's because this layer directly samples the large cooling signal, the direct radiative signal of CO2 increase. And it's a region that has very small natural variability, a very large signal, and critically also very different patterns of forced response and intrinsic variability. All of those things help you. The big global mean signal, the small noise, and the differences in signal and noise patterns. This led to this statement that we made in the paper. When you're at signal to noise ratios of nearly 40, it is indeed virtually impossible to posit that natural causes can explain the observed changes in the thermal structure of the atmosphere. In my opinion, it's critically important to continue doing this work because even in today's world, there are very influential folks out there claiming that all observed climate change is purely natural due to the sun, intrinsic variability, volcanoes, some combination thereof. It's difficult to make those kind of claims with a straight face, given such compelling scientific evidence of human fingerprints on the thermal structure of the atmosphere. So thanks very much. I just wanted to say again, as John mentioned, that I'm around for 3 weeks. I'll be at the Wilkes Center. My door is open. Part of the reason I'm here is to find out what you are doing and see whether there are points of intersection between your work and the kind of fingerprinting work that I still am doing in the atmosphere, and now at Woods Hole, I'm also doing in the ocean. So thanks very much for inviting me to Utah. Happy to answer any questions. Yes.
Well, I assume it's smoother in the stratosphere because it's a highly reddened signal that's an integrator of variability fluctuations over a long time period. In that regard, when you mentioned the oceans at the very end, can we just look at the deep oceans instead? What does the stratosphere provide us? We don't live in either place. That's added information.
Well, I think the stratosphere is interesting to look at because it confirms a longstanding prediction. And to me, one of the tests of theory is whether it makes predictions that are falsifiable. The Manabe and Weatherall prediction back in 1967 was a prediction. It could have been falsified by better satellite data. In the end, they were right. And to me, that's an important point to make. Another thing is that this region of the atmosphere, as Manabe and Weatherall showed, is where you see the primary radiative signal of CO2 increase. There is some ozone-induced signal up there as well, but the ozone-induced temperature changes are much larger in the lower stratosphere. So it's a portion of the atmosphere where you would want to go to look for a human-caused CO2 signal, and that's what we do here. Is that directly relevant to human experience? Clearly not. You know, it's much more important to understand arguably the causes of tropospheric temperature change and to disentangle human and natural effects in the troposphere where we live. But like I said, in terms of verifying long-standing predictions and in terms of really very convincingly showing that the sun explains all surface climate change hypothesis doesn't fit the bill. You know, you could see that in the global mean temperature changes, the solar fluctuations in stratospheric temperature, peak to peak, peak to trough, are small relative to the overall global mean stratospheric cooling signal. The intrinsic month to month, year to year, decade to decade variability in stratospheric temperature in observations and simulations is trivially small relative to the 37-year signal. That's important to show because, again, there are voices out there who are arguing that all surface warming is natural. I think this analysis helps to effectively refute those kind of claims. But I fully agree that it's important to do this kind of work with as many variables as we can. And we're doing that in the ocean now. With colleagues at Woods Hole, we're looking at things like upper ocean heat content, at PCO2, at a variety of different ocean observables that we really care about. We want to know how and why they are changing. So, you know, the challenge in this kind of work is to never rest on your laurels, to constantly be refining it and extending it and looking at the physical and internal consistency between different aspects of climate change. Does that make sense?
So I mean, they read into aspect of the smoothing of the signal.
I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean by the.
If something is very smooth, then
Yeah.
I guess it's usually an integrator, and brought up passing into it. It's an integrator of past variability. It's not showing current short-term fluctuations. It's showing it's presumably smooth.
No, I think that's more true in the ocean, which is an
Okay.
integrator
That's not
of.
in the ocean, the deep ocean is very smooth.
Yeah, the deep ocean is very smooth. Now, the stratosphere shows short-term variability. There are things like the Brewer-Dobson circulation that have critical impact on seasonal and interannual timescale variability. There are things like the quasi-biennial oscillation in the tropical lower stratosphere and even higher up that have immediate impact on stratospheric temperature. So the ocean is an integrator of short timescale variability in the atmosphere, but the stratosphere really isn't an integrator in the same way that the ocean is. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so, what, this work wouldn't have been possible without, rectifying that difference in the microwave, record. So what exactly, maybe there are many things, but what were the main issues that allowed the community to bring those microwave records, into some sort of, description that you could use to do this?
I think both for microwave sounders and for the stratospheric sounding units, the key issues were satellite orbit drift. So this isn't one satellite up there for the entire 37-year period. This is multiple satellites with different lifetimes, and many of them drift over their lifetimes. And that's particularly important with polar orbiting satellites that are supposed to see the same location on the Earth's surface at the same time of day. So if you're drifting 4 to 6 hours over the lifetime of the satellite, that affects the time of day at which you see the Earth's surface, and you have to adjust for that.
That seems like a really easy thing to do. Just have multiple generations of sensors.
You can actually see the step-off drops in the MSC sounding data when they deploy the new ones. Like when I was looking at the data, you can actually see the new implementation.
Yeah.
Right. You would think it's an easy thing to do, but the lesson is it's not, and there are multiple reasons for that. So one group, the University of Alabama, actually made a sign error in adjusting for the effects of satellite orbit drift on the sampling of the diurnal cycle. They got the sign wrong. And another group, remote sensing systems in Santa Rosa, was unable to replicate their results. But it turns out that if you want to adjust for the effects of satellite orbit drift on the sampling of the diurnal cycle, you have to know pretty well what the diurnal cycle is in space and in time. And there's observational uncertainty there. GPS radio occultation may help us and get us better estimates of the diurnal cycle that we can use to adjust for this orbit drift. But people have used climate model simulations, which have errors in the diurnal cycle. People have used reanalyses to adjust for satellite drift in sampling the diurnal cycle. Reanalyses differ, sometimes markedly, in terms of their portrayal of the diurnal cycle based on what they assimilate and, you know, what kind of four-dimensional variational assimilation scheme they use. So it's not as easy as you might think it would be. And that's just one component. There are instrument calibration drift issues. So these microwave sounders calibrate by looking at an onboard hot wire target and at cold space. And it turns out that the onboard hot wire target calibration was drifting as the instrument was being heated by the sun. And you have to account for that drift after the fact, and it's nonlinear. And different groups did that in different ways. Another issue is that in the microwave sounders, there was a transition in 1998 to 2003 between microwave sounders and advanced microwave sounders. And the advanced sounders measure at different frequencies and at more frequencies. So that required satellite data analysts to stitch together the pre-1998 and post-1998 satellite records. And that means you have to take subjective decisions in terms of how best to do that. So, as I like to say, these things are not a thermometer in space. They're complex geophysical retrievals, and different groups made different decisions, still do make different decisions on how to adjust for these complex non-climatic effects. And that matters, but the primary differences that Dave Thompson revealed there between the Hadley Center group and the NOAA group, over time, as scientists began to really dig deeper and try and understand what they were doing differently, many of those differences were resolved.
Yeah. So my first paper with Susan showed that there's a fundamental difference between the Antarctic and Arctic ozone holes, and that the Arctic air is never isolated enough to become cold to give you the same amount of surface area to sort of sustain polar stratospheric clouds, and that messes with all the chemistry. And so my question is, if the stratosphere is cooling, presumably that makes it easier for us to lose ozone in the Arctic. And I'm wondering if you've done any projections of how much more the stratosphere will cool, especially in that lower stratospheric ozone layer, and how that cooling timeline lines up with how quickly we're trying to clean up our CFCs. Because if it cools faster than we can clean up our CFCs, we might be seeing even more ozone loss in the Arctic than we are seeing now, because of this climate change driven sort of cooling of the stratosphere. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on like how quickly is it cooling? Do we have any projections for what's going to happen to stratosphere temperature, the lower part, by 2100?
Great question. And one thing I forgot to mention is that the CMIP6 historical runs end in 2014. So in order to make comparisons with satellite data over the full period of record of the SSU data, 1986 through to 2022, we spliced together the CMIP6 historical runs with SSP 585. So, this estimate, the storyline, if you will, of how emissions will change under a particular development of population and all that kind of stuff. and emissions. So your question is answerable, is what I'm trying to say. We only looked at the historical period in this paper, but the different SSPs make different assumptions about emissions, and we could look at them. And even, in the SSP that we did look at, we could go beyond the historical period and into the future and look at how temperatures continue to change in the Arctic and in the Antarctic under different assumptions about changes in CFCs and changes in CO2 and
So
stuff like that.
basically, global warming and stratospheric cooling will cause ozone loss to become suddenly much worse in the Arctic than it is now.
Yeah, and
Where that tipping point is, so it'll be interesting.
one of the things that intrigues me, and I alluded to this very briefly. Oh, there you are.